Coming up on Tech News Weekly, it's me, Jason Howell, and my co-host, Mikah Sargent. We welcome Alex Kantrowitz back from the Big Technology Podcast. He helps us understand the mess and a little bit of the cleanup that's happening between Facebook, Google, and Australia regarding news. Also, Karl Bode, writing for Vice, breaks down the return of net neutrality law in California and what it took to get here. Mikah and I actually discuss new features coming to Android devices and how updates on Android differ to that on the iOS platform. Very interesting discussion there. And then Mikah details some of Twitter's most recent announcements today of a paid subscription service called Superfollow. That and more coming up next on Tech News Weekly.
Podcasts you love
from people you trust.
This is TWiT.
This is Tech News Weekly, episode 172, recorded Thursday, February 25th, 2021. This episode of Tech News Weekly is brought to you by Melissa. Like expired milk, 30% of your customers' data goes bad every year. That's money down the drain. Visit Melissa's developer portal for free access to data quality APIs, demos, and code samples. Freshen up your sour data today with 1,000 records cleaned for free at melissa.com/twit.
And by Hover. Whether you're a developer, photographer, or small business, Hover has something for you to expand your projects and get the visibility you want. Go to hover.com/twit to get 10% off your first purchase of any domain extension for the entire first year.
And by Nureva. Getting your audio ready for meetings back in the office? Well, Nureva Audio is designed for distancing. It automatically adapts to new room configurations so you're ready for the new normal and whatever comes next. Learn more at nureva.com/twit.
Hello, and welcome to Tech News Weekly, the show where every week we talk to and about the people making and breaking the tech news. I am one of your hosts, Mikah Sargent, and the kind gentleman over there zooming in all dramatically. Who are you, sir?
I'm looking deep into your eyes, folks. I'm Jason Howell. It's good to be here. Good to see you with these eyes, Mikah.
With these here eyes, well, I do declare it is good to see you too. There's always an accent. I don't know where it comes from.
Something to be found there. Yeah.
Yeah. One accent.
Not an Australian accent, though, I might add.
That was my segue. Thank you very much.
There you go.
One of the accents I'm not good at is an Australian accent. Although I used to watch a show that was Australian, and there for a while I had it, but I don't anymore. But speaking of Australia, and I'm refraining from saying down under at any point during this conversation, there have been some things going on over in Australia, Facebook and Google in particular, and sort of the future of news publishing and whatever Facebook and Google kind of are in between a news publisher and the folks that exist on social media trying to get to the news. So I am excited to finally, we really wanted to be covering this topic, really wanted to be talking about it. And as things are sort of settling in, who better to talk about big technology than Alex Kantrowitz of the Big Technology newsletter. Welcome back to the show, Alex.
Great to see you guys. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we are happy to have you here. I think the best way for us to kind of start out this conversation is at the beginning. So with Australia kind of working toward a bit of legislation that was aimed at or at least on the face of it, it was aimed at claiming funds, claiming money for news publishers in Australia. That, of course, had a big impact on companies like Facebook and Google, who in different ways kind of exist as in-betweens, as the middle men, as it were, the middle people, as it were. So I was hoping that you could kind of start by giving our listeners a little bit of a rundown of the legislation and what Google and Facebook's roles are in this, especially given that, these are only two of many different social media networks and potential sort of platform publishers.
Absolutely. It's extremely simple, actually, when it comes down to it. It's a law that is called a bargaining law, which basically says news publishers are not on the same footing when it comes to bargaining with companies like Facebook and Google, which are enormous in terms of the value that these platforms get from news content. So the Australian law essentially is meant to force, an evening out of the bargaining power by putting the big platforms into arbitration with news publishers if they want to get paid, if the news publishers want to get paid for the content on that's going on to Facebook and Google. So, of course, Facebook and Google, they link out to news sites, but news sites have felt that they're not getting, the right amount of value in return. And so this law seeks to even the playing.
Okay. So that is, I like that as a kind of the base understanding of this. With that comes some concerns about sort of the motivations behind this regulation, and of course Google and Facebook kind of taking different routes to work their way through this legislation. And I can remember a friend of mine who's a developer was talking. He lives in Australia, works in Australia, and was talking about how for the longest time Google would pop up these notifications. News on Google is going to change. News on Google is going to change over and over and over again. And so these two companies have kind of looked at different ways of informing Australians about this legislation. But of course, each side of this conversation have different things that they want to get out of it. So I was hoping you could kind of provide a little bit of clarity on sort of the arguments for this legislation, which I think are more clear, but perhaps it's the arguments against the legislation that are not as clear. Why are Google and Facebook kind of fighting back? And what are some of the folks who are sort of against this legislation? What is it that they're saying is so wrong about it?
Well, Google and Facebook have both given in their own ways. Google decided that it will, make deals with publishers. Facebook pushed back on the law a little bit, got some, small concessions, but ultimately decided it would come to the table too. And after banning news on its service for about a week, it's restoring it pretty much as we speak. The arguments against this kind of law, and I'm about to get into this in the newsletter that's about to go live, is that it puts too much power in the hands of the tech giants. Like if you're protesting the fact that the tech giants like Facebook and Google have too much power, now you're going to make yourself financially beholden to them. It doesn't really make a lot of sense. And of course, it will just deepen the relationship with these publishers and the big platforms. And honestly, I think it's time to just re-examine that whole thing. I think now more than ever, it's hard to see what publishers actually get out of Facebook and what Facebook gets out of the news itself. I think that publishers, by playing ball with Facebook, have flattened and commoditized the work they do. Facebook is much better at making money from their audiences before the click than they are after the click. So they've essentially given up the game to Facebook. And then for Facebook, you speak with Australians who have experienced this change over the past week, and they say their newsfeed's been great. It's been more peaceful. It's been less divisive, less toxic, more friends and family focused. They like it better. So I think this is a great point in time for us to ask ourselves, in particular when it comes to the Facebook case, should Facebook and news actually be married at all? And I think there's good reason to start to call for a divorce. And that's what I argue this week in the newsletter. Let's split it up.
So with things now seemingly returning to more of a stabilized place, do we know if this was more of an example of Facebook backing down or more of an example of the Australian government kind of giving in and making some concessions along the way?
Yeah, I think it's everybody giving in a little bit. Facebook will now have to pay some publishers. So that's a backing down. The government sort of, backed off a little bit in terms of its stricter laws. That's a bit of a back down as well. And now publishers are going back to Facebook. And I think ultimately that's going to harm them. One of the most interesting things to come out of this whole situation is that the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, ABC, different from the ABC in the US, but ABC there, had a long neglected, long overlooked news app. It was being downloaded less than 1,000 times a day at the end of January. And all of a sudden, downloads skyrocketed. And last week, it was being downloaded 15,000 times a day, and then it remained in that range for the next few days. After that, it became the #1 app on the iOS App Store and the Google Play Store in Australia during that time. And so what that means is, instead of relying on an intermediary, as Mikah mentioned at the top, what these news organizations like ABC were doing was forming direct relationships with their audiences. That data wasn't going to Facebook, it was going to them. They weren't being flattened, they were distinct. And ultimately, they did lose little traffic, but they are able to write stories in a way that builds trust with an audience versus something that is meant for a share button, which we know just incentivizes outrage, sensationalism, and divisive type of stories. So I think there was a shining, bright moment for news publishers, in the eye of the storm, where they saw what life was like without Facebook. And I'm hoping that what we come out of the other side of this is that, both they and Facebook realize that this was a marriage of convenience. Facebook got engagement, publishers got traffic, but ultimately it went sour, and everybody's losing from it. And I hope we see more publishers take a look and decide to completely abandon Facebook as a result, and try to build their audience the old-fashioned way with a direct relationship. And I think those that do will be rewarded tremendously.
I find this interesting that Facebook, in finally saying, okay, here's the deal, we're going to go forward with, bringing news back to Facebook and working out the legislation in a way that is favorable to them as well as the other side. One of the things that was left in kind of in the legislation was the right for Facebook to once again ban news on the platform. And it sounds to me kind of, you're saying that in the event where the company isn't able to, the news publisher isn't able to come to a commercial agreement with Facebook, and arbitration doesn't work in whatever way it might, and Facebook chooses to just not allow that could be a positive thing for these individual news publishers, because that move to Facebook as a means of growth has hampered these companies in a big way. And I look back at some of the stories about Facebook and its push into video, and how it in many ways overestimated the views. And I speaking from experience, I was a news journalist at a company that was primarily video news. And I remember the shift from our video news on kind of our own platform to Facebook. And, afterwards learning that maybe Facebook's views were not as accurate as one thought. So I feel that when it comes to Facebook, there's a long history of what's clearly a concern. But I'd love to talk a little bit more before we say goodbye about Google, because one of the main examples that I've seen folks give is, and it's one that I've used myself, is when I do a Google search for, how to fix a flat tire, and the 5 or 6 steps pop up right there in the Google search, and I'm able to use that information to help me. Does that fall in the same category as the rest of this legislation? Are those publishers that do sort of help guides going to be helped out in this, or is it just publications that are covering news? So if I did a search for a helicopter crash, then the news would pop up and let me know that there was a helicopter crash. I wouldn't go to CNN, for example, and learn about it there. Does it cover kind of all types of publishers, or are we just talking specifically about kind of news media publishers?
Well, I think it's a live developing situation. I was speaking with one Australian publisher last week that said that they were totally banned on Facebook and then had to protest and say, well, we're not news. And they let them back, but didn't allow links. And then, of course, Facebook infamously also started blocking links from public health organizations. So this law isn't even in action yet. And I think we're going to spend some, like with all laws, right? It's a blunt instrument. And then we spend some time figuring out, exactly how it's applied. But, the example that you bring up with Google, that makes a lot more sense to me than the Facebook example. With Google relies on providing up-to-date, accurate information to people searching for answers. And so news organizations provide that, and actually linking to news organizations and summing up their work actually does do a lot of good for Google. It definitely benefits from it. So, and it's good for news organizations. I mean, of course, they might write like more SEO style headlines, but it's not like, you're going to, the more outrageous your article or the more sensational your article, the better chance it has in showing up on Google. Although it might change the way that you write stuff. For instance, you might decide to write articles based off of highly searched terms, which happens all the time. But anyway, long story short, I think that the Google situation makes a lot more sense. And I don't think anybody has a full understanding of what sites are going to be included and what won't. And I think it will be sort of an ad hoc, bit by bit, because ultimately, like, what is a news site, right? If I have a hobby blog, but I post that, there's a good deal at Walmart, I'm breaking news to my followers. So by the nature, it's always a great area. And there are many great conferences that go on with the Future of News set where they try to figure out what news actually is. So I don't think Australia has come to the perfect definition. And we'll just watch it play out as this thing goes on over the next couple months.
Absolutely. Well, Alex Kantrowitz, I want to thank you so much for your time today. And as we continue to watch, we'll continue to watch your work and see what you have to say about it. I'm looking forward to reading that newsletter later today. If folks want to follow you online, where can they go to do that?
I think the best place to go is Big Technology Podcast. It wraps up the news of the week, and we have a guest every Wednesday that's either a tech insider or outside agitator. Wael Ghonim, who started the Egyptian revolution 10 years ago, came on this week to talk about how social media has evolved. And next week, we have Kayvon Begpour, who's the head of product at Twitter, who's going to talk about all these interesting new products that Twitter's been releasing. So I say Big Technology Podcast is the good place to go, and I'll share all the other links there. So that's my pitch.
Awesome. Thanks so much. We appreciate you.
Thank you, Alex.
Gentlemen. Likewise, always great to talk.
All right, we'll talk to you soon. And great timing with the Twitter interview. We're going to be talking about that news a little bit later in the show. Just a little bit of a tease for you. Coming up next, the return of net neutrality, at least in California, but you have to start somewhere, right? But first, this episode of Tech News Weekly is brought to you by Melissa. If you've ever forgotten to check the date on a carton of milk, oh man, that's a horrible mistake when you do that. You know it immediately. Like milk, our customer data goes bad. In fact, up to 30% of customer data goes bad every year. It times out. It dates out. So much changes, right? So you put in data one year, the next year, so much of it is just different. And how does that get updated? How is that even flagged to be updated? Well, Melissa makes sure that your data is accurate and current, so you reach the right customers. They have tools that have helped businesses maintain fresh data for over 35 years. And you can be one of those businesses not throwing money down the drain because you have bad data. And Melissa's going to help you with that. You can verify addresses, emails, phone numbers, and names, all done in real time with Melissa. Melissa has a global address verification service that actually verifies addresses for more than 240 countries and territories at the point of entry. So this is like real time when you're entering something in and you get that feedback immediately. That's what this is all about. It ensures that only valid billing and shipping addresses are captured and used in your systems. You can also identify your customers and really kind of get to know them by adding consumer demographic information to your records. So things that dive a little bit deeper, property and mortgage data, marital status, social media handles, those are incredibly important and valuable. Melissa's flexible deployment options offer different platforms to suit any preference, any business size or budget. They have flexible on-prem web service, secure FTP processing, and software as a service delivery options. So you can choose the best way to really just kind of meet you where your business is and what your business needs. Melissa continually undergoes independent security audits, and that's, of course, to reinforce their commitment to data security, to privacy and compliance requirements. They have the utmost dedication to your data's security. They implement strong controls and safeguards when processing your data, so SOT2, HIPAA compliant, GDPR compliant, and more than 10,000 businesses trust Melissa, the address experts. Melissa is supporting communities and qualifying essential workers during COVID-19 as well. So see if your organization qualifies for 6 months of free service just by applying online. So don't put up with sour customer contact data. You don't have to anymore. Try Melissa's APIs in the developer portal. Super easy to log on and sign up and start playing in the API sandbox anytime, 24/7. And you can get started today with 1,000 records cleaned for free at melissa.com/twit. That's melissa.com/twit. And we thank Melissa for their support of Tech News Weekly and the TWiT network. All right, so I promised net neutrality is coming. Do you remember that? I remember net neutrality. It was the thing before Ajit Pai made his way to the head of the FCC. I suppose the transition away may have started a little bit before him, but it really intensified then. Ajit Pai and the FCC began actively seeking to kind of kill net neutrality regulation. Well, with the new Biden presidency comes the departure of Pai from his chairman role. Times are changing in many different ways right now, as we've all seen. And joining us to talk about the resurgence of net neutrality law is Karl Bode, who wrote for Vice about California's big net neutrality win. Welcome back.
Hey there. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's really great to see you. It's been a little while, so I'm happy we could get you on today. So, okay, so, so much has happened in so many facets of our lives in the last 4 years. Net neutrality was just one of those things. And I remember when all of this was dusting up, it was such a big deal. And then, we get consumed with everything else. Now we're back. And I suppose, it's a good thing that we can, get used to hearing the term net neutrality and, stories like this. So maybe recap a little bit what's happened in the past few years prior to some of these recent developments happening in California.
So, this is a battle that's been going on for, I think, more than a decade at this point. I think the FCC in 2010 passed their first net neutrality rules, which were really kind of flimsy. They didn't cover wireless at all. They had a lot of loopholes for broadband providers. And the broadband industry still sued to overturn them because their goal has always been really no federal or state oversight of their businesses at all. And they won that lawsuit. And then the FCC returned in 2015 and passed tougher rules that the industry then sued again to overturn and failed. And then Ajit Pai came to the FCC, at which point he decided he was going to dismantle the rules, despite the fact, they have the broad bipartisan support of the majority of Americans. And once they got rid of them, the states immediately rushed to fill that vacuum with their own rules, most of them, California being the biggest one. But interestingly enough, the FCC's repeal of net neutrality attempted to also ban states from being able to protect consumers. So they didn't want oversight on the federal level. They didn't want it on the state level. They basically wanted to have their cake and eat it too. They didn't want any oversight. And this week a court declared that California would be allowed to go forth and start enforcing their own rules. In part thanks to the fact that the Biden administration backed off of trying to back a lawsuit via the industry that would have scuttled the California rules. So it's been a very thorny, complicated mess. But this week, the California finally got the green light to start enforcing their own rules, which were slightly tougher than the ones the FCC created in 2015.
Okay, and then taking a look at this, I suppose what I was trying to figure out, but I think you kind of answered my question, which was whether this shift, this transition in California, because a lot of this pushback in California started well before our current Biden presidency. Could this have happened last year? Could this, or rather, could this have still happened if Trump had been reelected to another presidency? Would it have been likely that this would reach this moment in court, or things would be looking at a completely different scenario?
I think they still would have had problems because, the argument of the broadband industry is that states, the federal government can't regulate them, but states can't either. And the courts have repeatedly found that, if the FCC is going to go out and say, okay, we really don't care about consumer protection anymore, we're just not going to do it. Right. The FCC and others can't just go and say that states can't fill that void. It's just the courts, haven't agreed with them. And that's their basic argument at this point. So I think it was important that the Biden FCC pulled the DOJ's support from the lawsuit But I still think they would have run into problems because their legal argument here is basically they want no oversight of these massive monopolies. And I think the one thing that gets overlooked is that, net neutrality is itself a very thorny policy issue, but it really comes down to broadband competition or the lack of it. These broadband providers wouldn't engage in dodgy anti-competitive behavior if their customers could vote with their wallets and switch to another ISP. So net neutrality rules were kind of this stopgap attempt to hold them accountable for bad behavior in the absence of competition. But if you actually embrace policies that drove more competition to markets, this would have never been a problem. So that's, I think it comes down to monopolization, which is something that kind of gets overlooked in the policy discussions.
So, okay, so then we're here where things are kind of changing, at least in the state of California. We can talk about kind of how that broadens out in a second. But what exactly does this pave the way for? Like, what power does this then seem to give, at least in the state of California?
So California can now start enforcing their law, which was a little tougher than the FCC rules. So if like Comcast starts throttling a competitor's service because it competes with its own service, California can step in and have the authority to hold them accountable for that. Now, I think the federal government is also going to eventually restore federal net neutrality rules, but that requires that they appoint a third FCC Democratic commissioner so that they have the voting ability to make it happen. And that's probably going to happen here in the next weeks to months.
Okay. Yeah. That was another big question that I had is kind of, this is great for California. How does it broaden out? But it sounds like from what you're saying, the likelihood of the FCC kind of reversing course on a broad sense for throughout the U.S. is pretty high, depending on some near-term changes. What are those changes exactly?
Well, to vote to restore net neutrality, the FCC is broken down on a partisan basis. So whoever wins the White House has a 3-2 majority at the FCC. But right now they're gridlocked at 2-2 commissioners. So the Biden administration has to appoint that third commissioner, at which point they'll probably vote to restore the rules. Now, the problem here is you end up with this regulatory ping pong, as they call it, where the FCC votes to dismantle the rules. And ideally, you would want Congress to just pass decent, basic net neutrality rules that say monopolies can't abuse their gatekeeper power. The problem with that argument is that, Congress is pretty heavily awash in telecom campaign contributions. So the chance of a bill with any kind of consumer protection teeth getting through there is, kind of thin. So we'll see. But in the interim, once the FCC restores them, then we can get back to the real conversation about, what's the real issue? And the real issue is that there's just not a lot of competition in broadband. I think 83 million Americans have the choice of just one ISP, which is usually Comcast, and that results in all kinds of problems. Net neutrality just being one of them, high prices, bad customer service, spotty coverage, slow speeds, privacy violations, net neutrality violations. So it's all tied into one conversation. And I think, when I see net neutrality talked about, I see a lot of people's eyes kind of glaze over. So I think it's important to make it clear to people that this is really about a lack of U.S. broadband competition. And if we solve that problem, we wouldn't have to engage in these policy debates at all, because the market would kind of help let customers move to a different ISP if they had any of those problems.
How do you feel about kind of these emerging disruptors? Like Starlink comes to mind, of this idea of beaming the internet from a satellite, and like a solid support system as the foundation of that. Do you think that's like, how much does that help in this discussion? Yeah,
it helps. Starlink is going to be great for the people that are stuck in rural markets, and currently either have no access or have terrible, expensive old satellite access. So I think Starlink's going to be great for those folks. The problem with Starlink is it really still doesn't, satellites have to operate under the laws of physics, and they just don't have enough capacity, even these new lower orbit ones, to really deliver any massive scale in semi-populated areas. So the problem you're going to run into with Starlink is it will be great for these rural outliers and for some people, but it's really not going to make a dent. 42 million people, I think, have no broadband whatsoever. Another 83 million live under a monopoly. So, and I think Starlink will hit a couple million over the next couple of years. So with that scale, it's just not going to do it. You run into the same problems where with wireless. 5G is heralded as this magic thing, but you need fiber run to towers to make 5G work, and the investment on that front has been kind of skimpy for some time. So these things will help, and they'll definitely help for people in rural markets, but they're not going to really fix the monopoly or duopoly problem that you see in a lot of these American markets.
That's fascinating, man. That number is so high of people without internet access. I'm not sure I would have ever guessed that it would be that much. Yeah. It's so easy to be inside of our bubbles and just kind of expect that everybody kind of has the same opportunity, or at least access to one ISP, but to have none, that just blows me away in 2021.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah.
One of the problems is the FCC's broadband maps have not been that great. I think the official FCC tally for people without broadband is somewhere around 20 million, but independent researchers have found that's actually double that. So, that's what they're working on now, is trying to get our broadband mapping to actually determine what areas do or don't have broadband service. So that's step one. Once you do that, you can identify competitive shortcomings and try to push some policies that help.
Yeah, having clear data is obviously the very first place you should go. Then you can go from there. We already kind of know what the broadband industry has done, in the past, let's say the last 4 or 5, 6 years, when things have gotten really friendly for them, but also prior leading up to that. Knowing historically what they've done and knowing kind of where the tea leaves are pointing that we're headed right now when it comes to net neutrality regulation, what do you expect to see from them in response to all of this? I mean, I imagine a whole lot of litigation, but what do you think about that?
Well, they'll appeal the California case, and I'm sure when the FCC tries to restore it, they will complain and they will file more lawsuits. But their arguments are growing thinner by the moment when you have such a profound monopoly. I think they're fortunate right now because the conversation is so fixated on big tech. Big tech has a lot of problems. There are things that we need to work on, but it's kind of sucked all the oxygen out of the room and allowed us to forget these other problems in the telecom sector. And I think they're going to find, with COVID creating a lot of new political pressure that I've never seen before on this subject, I think they're going to find it harder to use the arguments that they used in the past, that, this isn't a real problem, or this is just dated old regulation that's saddling our innovation capabilities, which is never, if you've talked to Comcast customer support at any point, innovation is really not high on the list of your experience. But, so I think they're going to trot out a lot of the same old arguments, and I don't think they're going to work as well in this new COVID reality, because the pandemic has really showcased how broadband is essential for survival and opportunity and employment and healthcare and everything. And I think people who didn't realize that before, which was already a shrinking segment, have kind of keyed in now. So I think the entire policy field has in broadband has shifted pretty dramatically.
Yeah. Well said. Well spoken. Karl, such a pleasure to get you back on the show. Really appreciate you taking time to break this all apart in such a succinct way and give us your take on this. Karl, you wrote this article for Vice, but I know you're writing for a few different places right now. If people want to follow all of your work online, where should they go?
Check me out at Karl Bode on Twitter. I also write at Techter and pretty frequent contributor over at Vice's Motherboard. So those are my primary outlets right now. And I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, you bet. We'll be in touch. I'm sure this is a topic that isn't going anywhere anytime soon. So we'll reach out to you again. Great. Thank you, Karl. Take care of yourself.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
All right. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks so much, Karl. Coming up, some interesting features and changes have come to Android, and we've got somebody who knows a thing or two here to talk about it. But first, I do want to tell you that this week's episode of Tech News Weekly is brought to you by Hover. The new year holds a lot of promise, so you can make plans and let Hover help you achieve them. If you're a blogger, if you're creating a portfolio, if you're building an online store, or maybe you just want to make a memorable redirect to your LinkedIn page, well, Hover has the best domain names and email addresses just for you. Email at your domain name is key to connecting with customers and building trust for your brand. That is so true. When I, talk to somebody about a business thing, and they're, how do I get in touch with you? And they say blah 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 at yahoo.com, blah 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 at some thing that anybody can get. It makes me a little hesitant. And so having an email with your own domain name is really important. They have domain-based email for all your needs, small or large, and it's really easy to set up. I've set up a Hover email account very easily. You can add as many mailboxes to your domain as you need, and when your domain renews, well, your mailbox will too. And the prices are sincerely unbeatable. Their most popular mailbox is a no-brainer solution for business owners. Get access from anywhere. You can use the email app you're already comfortable with, and if apps aren't your thing, well, no worries, because Hover's webmail can be accessed wherever you are. I love Hover, probably a little too much, because I've got a ridiculous number of domains, and I always find myself buying more. And that's because Hover makes it so easy to do. You could go in, you type in the idea that you have, and then even if the domain that you want isn't there, they'll pop up some suggestions for other things. And then this is where they really get me, is they have Apple Pay support. And so I could be in the middle of a show right now, and somebody says something funny, and I could go hover.com. I'm already logged in. I type in that name. I find that domain that I want. I choose select, and then I hit the next button, Apple Pay with my fingerprint, and suddenly I've got another domain. Oh no! Oh yay! That is what I love about Hover, is how easy they make it. Because take it from somebody who used to way back in the day run a little web design business on the side. It used to be very difficult to get a domain set up and to make sure you had everything figured out. This makes it so simple to do, and you may find yourself getting a domain or 9. Hover isn't here to upsell you on stuff you don't need either. In fact, Hover just wants to help. They've got pro-level tools, so powerful domain and email management tools that are intuitive and easy to use, whether you're a web pro or just getting started. And that's for real, because there's some stuff, A names, C names, all these weird domain things that you have to figure out. And Hover makes a lot of that so simple, where you can get things set up just by clicking the right buttons, following through their tutorial to get things set up. It's also private and secure with Whois privacy protection included with your domain purchase. Your private information will remain just that. It's private. It's a great way to reduce spam and protect yourself from unwanted solicitations. Again, take it from me, who before I knew about Hover, set up some accounts and had to, you're required by law to provide your address. And little did I know that that was going to be made public. And I started every other week getting just these packages in my mail of companies trying to get me to buy their stamps or get me to buy their pens with my name on them and my address and all this other stuff. And that's because I didn't have Whois privacy protection, because I wasn't using Hover. Hover does that. It's built in. You don't have to pay extra for it. And the thing that I was just talking about was Hover Connect, which lets you pick the service you want to use to build and host your website. So without having to figure out all that extra nonsense, Connect helps you start using your domain name with just a couple of clicks. At Hover, you are a customer and not a source of data. Take back control of your data with reliable, tracker-free email. Yeah, they're talking about one of those big companies that looks at what's going on in your email and uses that to market to you. Hover is trusted by hundreds of thousands of customers who use their domain names and email to turn their ideas into a reality. Whether you're a developer, photographer, or small business, Hover has something for you to expand your projects and get the visibility you want. Just go to hover.com/twit to get 10% off your first purchase of any domain extension for the entire first year. That's hover.com/twit for 10% off your domain extension for a full year. And of course, we thank Hover for their support, and I thank Hover for being the home of my way too many domains and continually making it so simple to get those domains registered every year or add new ones to the plate, as it were. Thanks so much, Hover, for sponsoring us. We do appreciate it. All right. It's time for our special guest to tell us all about Android's new updates. We would like to welcome to the show Jason the Robot Howell.
Thank you for inviting me. It's such an honor to be on your show, Mikah.
Well, I'm so glad you're here. So my first question no, I'm just kidding. But I did. So this is what's kind of funny about this is one might think, because I host a show on the network called iOS Today, and you host a show on the network called All About Android, that maybe this would have been something that you brought to the table. But in fact, it was the reverse. I saw this really cool article about some of the new features that were going to be coming to Android. And I thought, oh, I really want to talk about that. And who better to do so than Jason? So yeah, tell me about some of these new features before we kind of talk a little bit about the differences between Apple's mechanism of update and Google's mechanism of update.
Yeah, and I'm very interested to talk about that portion with you, Mikah, because they are very different, and I definitely have opinions. I'm curious to know what you think. But first of all, the changes. And what kind of blows me away is we talked about some of these, but not all of these on All About Android. I don't know how we didn't address all of this stuff on Tuesday. So even though this was news on Tuesday, this is news that I'm speaking for the first time because apparently it missed, some of it missed my radar on Tuesday. So some changes coming to Android devices. It's kind of a little bit of a hodgepodge, which is usually the case for this sort of update, which is something that we can definitely talk about. But we've got a new password checkup feature. So there's autofill, so that if you store your password inside of the system on Android, you've got an autofill feature to fill these in and to protect them on the back end. Well, now it's going to check your credentials if you've opted in, if you've given it the permission to do so, to know whether your ID/password that you're putting in there actually matches up on a database of breaches. And so as you're choosing the password, which is super handy, right? Don't use that password. It's already out there and known. So you can steer clear of that. Another one, which I'm totally going to use, because how many times have I had the idea that I need to send a text message to somebody, but it's like late at night or whatever, and the last thing I want to do is take the risk that they have their ringer or their vibrate on, and I don't want to wake them up if they're sleeping or something like that. So there's scheduled text messaging coming to Android messages. That's a nice little feature. You tap and hold the send, and it gives you the option to schedule a later time. So I think I love that idea. Yeah, super useful. I mean, there are other messaging apps and platforms that do this. It's nice to have it built into the standard messaging app on Android.
Yeah, because before you move, I want to talk about this one in particular, because I think this is such a brilliant idea. And again, yes, email is one example, but there are other apps that do that. But it's something that is a more regular pain point for me, given that most of the people that I am to whom I'm closest are in another time zone. Yeah. And in that time zone, it's 2 hours later. And so at night after work, you're talking with them and then it starts to get late. You don't want to wake them up. But then also there are times where you are able to, in the moment, see a message and you don't want to introduce the opportunity for a conversation because you don't have the time to have a conversation at the moment. And so what at least for me, this is the case. I see the message and then I'm like, oh, I'll respond to that later. And then I forget to respond to it. But to be able to say, okay, here's the message I'm going to send, just send it to them later. And then we'll have that conversation at that time. That's so good. So I think this feature is really cool.
Oh, I'm happy that you mentioned that because I hadn't even thought about that, but I've encountered that so many times. They're like, right now is not the time to get into this, but if I don't send this right now, I'm going to forget to do it later. I'm going to feel like a jerk. And so that's a really great use. I'm probably going to use that more than the one that I set up. So thank you for that. Other changes, an update to TalkBack. TalkBack is really an accessibility-driven screen reader for Android. So it's all kind of really designed to read out, audibly what's going on your device. It's geared for low vision and no vision users, and they've made some changes. They've improved the gesture system, a more unified menu system, better reading controls, just more features to kind of tack on. TalkBack has been around for a long time on Android, and they're showing that they're not just letting it slide, letting it degrade and everything, which is good. Android I have felt has always been in many ways behind iOS as far as really appealing to to users who require and lean in on accessibility features. They've made a lot of progress, and there's some features that are amazing that I'm not sure, like the live transcription that happens that you can turn on with a flick of a button. I use it all the time, and I have no accessibility reason to use it, but it's just so handy to not have to listen to something and read it anyways, and not have to have generated transcripts. It does it in real time. It's amazing. So Android's getting better in that with TalkBack. A couple of Assistant updates. So Assistant itself is going to allow for more broad usage when your device is locked, given that the user has opted in to say yes. But if you've turned this on, then you should be able to fire off a voice command to send a text all with your voice, even if your device is locked. And I'm not certain that you could do that before. You'd have to unlock it in order to get access to certain things with Assistant. It would do some things, but it wouldn't do other things that require deeper kind of permission. And I think this opens that up. And then, some news that we did talk about on All About Android was Android Auto, which is the in-car kind of on-device meant for driving sort of version of Android, that's really limited and, gives you large buttons and everything. It's meant to keep you from fiddling with your phone while you're driving. Well, they've introduced games, which on its face really sounds... Yes, on its face, it sounds really bad, right? Like, what, you're driving and you're playing games? They kind of target this as like, okay, well, it's not really meant for the driver. It's meant for like the passengers. Say you're going on a long distance trip. You're going on a road trip, and to kill time, it's all assistant driven. So it's all voice driven. The idea would be like to play a game of Jeopardy or Trivia Crack or something that everybody in the car can participate in.
That actually, yes, because I played the license plate alphabet game a bunch of time, all those different little games. And so if everybody in the car, I don't see, I think if they didn't just say games, if they said car games, I would immediately understand what they were talking about, or travel games or something like that. Yeah. When you hear games, I'm thinking, what, they want me playing Pac-Man with the console controller?
Well, especially we have, like the Tesla touchscreen is like the example of that. If you get into a Tesla, it has a full-blown game section with video games, so it's not that. I think the jury's still out though on whether this is still a great idea or not, because they've even had studies where, like, if you're driving and talking to someone, it's different than if you're driving and talking on the phone. Like, we use our brains a little differently, and as far as distraction and everything, I don't know. I suppose, it's the power is in your hands to decide whether you as a driver really want to participate in Jeopardy while you're on the road with a large vehicle. So, but
what
you can.
Is a car too close to my rear bumper?
Exactly. And then the last one, I mean, this is just a super quick, not a throwaway one, but if you like dark theme's coming for maps. I think what's interesting about this, and what I'm curious to hear. What's that? Sorry to interrupt. Is it just maps, or does Android have dark mode across other things? Yeah. So, I mean, and this has been kind of a challenge for Google, is that, yes, Android as a platform now has dark mode. I think that was an Android 10 or an Android 9 feature. I can't remember which one implemented it directly. And it's a system-wide toggle. So if there are supported apps that tap into that, then when you go into your system quick settings and you turn on dark mode, it will reach into all the apps that support that and flick them over to dark mode. And so when Google brought this to the platform, then it was like, okay, well, are our apps also supporting dark mode? And they've had to go in piece by piece and turn them on. And that, they're all different teams as part of the, the challenge of Google is that everybody's on a different team. And they have different priorities. So you see these things. And so here we are, a couple of years into dark theme, realm in Android, and Maps is just getting it. Better late than never, I suppose. But I do think that the kind of what I'm really interested to hear from you about this is the difference, like you mentioned, between kind of iOS updates and Android updates. When I look at this, I don't necessarily look at this and think this is an Android update. I look at this and think of this as Google updated a bunch of its apps with some major features. We're rolling them all out at the same time and telling you all about them. Mm-hmm. I don't know what the difference is. Maybe it's a distinction without a difference. I'm not sure, but it still feels like app updates to me versus like an Android update, which if it's an Android update, I think platform, and I think Android now supports dark mode. You know what I mean? I don't think Maps gets dark mode. That's an app change. But this is how I think Google has learned to do this in this approach. They also do it with Pixel phones. They do a Pixel feature drop, and many times that's like updates to little some of the apps that ship on Pixel phones that you don't get on other phones. So I get it. And yes, it is value, and it's neat that they do it. But I think they've figured out how to get news, how to get people to pay attention when they group them together like this, because it really makes it feel more like, hey, we're bringing new functionality to your phone. When in reality, it's kind of like, well, I had that app up. I have millions of apps on my phone, and they all update all the time, and they all bring new features. Right. How is this any different? I don't know. But anyways, I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
That makes it an interesting conversation, more so than even I thought it was, because when we look at it from that perspective of apps getting updates, that does kind of change things. Because so Apple is known for every year they have a big number update for their different operating systems. So iOS goes from iOS 10 to iOS 11. Mac OS took a big jump this year to Mac OS 11 for the first time. But in the grand scheme of things, Mac OS, goes from one location, Catalina, to Big Sur. And tvOS, iPadOS, all of them take this one big update. And at that time, you get all new features. Sometimes apps get updated to look entirely different, but it's feature updates for adding new functionality to Siri. These are huge changes, new features across the whole swath of different services that Apple provides. And there's been, a conversation about how when that happens, and when there are certain bugs or other issues that crop up, as they always do, you have to wait for Apple to do a point release. And so it's 11.1, 11.2, et cetera. And unless it's a huge show-stopping kind of bug, Apple's not likely to do 11.1.1 or 11.1.2. It's likely to wait until the next version, the next point release of the operating system. And one of the things that I liked, that I admire about Android is it the Google Play services? Is that what it's called?
Yep.
This idea that at any time Google can kind of push out a little bit of a fix for things more regularly if need be, versus having to wait for kind of a big point release. And so there's a difference between the two in that sense. And I do wish that Apple, I guess. I don't like the idea of the problem that I see is kind of what you were talking about there, where with Maps finally getting the change is if you've got these different teams that kind of work at different times and have different update schedules, then when Android rolls out this new system that has dark mode, all of the built-in apps don't have that support. But the way that Apple works is, this new feature comes with these changes that all of the teams kind of have to implement, and they do it from kind of the code base level and release a sort of developer code update that lets developers easily take advantage of, switching on dark mode. So in the same way that you described it, as the system kind of reaching into the apps that support it and turning on or off dark mode, that's the way that it works with iOS. But I think it's a little bit less about reaching in and flipping the switch, and it's more about the apps kind of reaching out and or plugging into the base system and listening for, if that makes sense. So it's it's kind of like, this is the control center and all of the apps are plugged in, versus the control center sending out a signal and saying, this is what you need to do. And so I like that approach because it does mean that there's a more cohesive look of things. But at the same time, to have to wait for 11.2 for some of the features, and a good example of this is these days, with the next version of iOS, and I can't remember if this one is out yet for everybody. That's a problem of being on the developer track, is that I get this stuff early.
Right. I know all about that. Yeah.
Right. And it is a feature that my partner, he works at a place. It's like a public. He works at a place where there are people who come in and he has to interact with them. So of course everybody's wearing masks, all that kind of thing. But when they go to pay for things, they, for the longest time, it's gotten a little bit better, but for the longest time, take off their mask to do their Face ID or their facial recognition to unlock their phone, put it back on, and then do their pay. Not good. And so Apple introduced an update for folks who have Apple Watches. Because the first update that took place was, it used to be that when you did Face ID and you were wearing a mask, Face ID would try about 3 times, and then it would say, okay, I can't recognize the face, and then it would prompt you to type in your password. So it took like 3 errors before it would prompt you to type in your password. Obviously, that's an issue. It needs to just do it automatically, immediately, so you're not waiting. So they released an update that actually could tell when someone was wearing a mask, and if it could tell you're wearing a mask, it would automatically prompt you for your password whenever you tried to Face ID. So a little bit quicker, and for most people who just have a PIN code, quite fast. For me, who's got a long alphanumeric code, takes a little bit longer. Then Apple, just most recently, finally released an update that if you've got an Apple Watch, because of the way that the two work and the way that you authenticate and the methods that Apple has in place for authentication, where it knows if you take the watch off of your wrist versus keeping it on, then when you put your watch on and you type in your code, you're showing I am me. And as long as you're wearing your watch throughout the day, if Face ID recognizes that you're wearing a mask, and it will automatically use your watch as the authentication to unlock your phone. And it taps you on your wrist to say, hey, your phone was unlocked. Press this button if you want to lock it. So that's like if somebody were to pick it up near you and look at it and it unlocked, you could quickly lock it. And then they would not be able to get into it because it immediately prompts for a password. So all of that's to say that update, it would have been nice to have that released as, just a quick little Google Play Services style change versus having to wait when, I as on the developer track, I'm telling my partner, I know that's so frustrating for you every day to have these people doing this. But if you just hold out, I promise pretty soon Apple's got this thing that's coming. And that's, as a person who's a little bit ahead of time, it's like, I want this to be available to you right now. So yeah, there's kind of I think that there are pros and cons, as there always are for both methods. But when we look at it from the perspective of Google is, gathering a bunch of neat app updates and collecting them together and sort of pushing it out there, it makes me wonder, and I don't do this as an Apple fanboy at all. Please believe me when I say this. I simply do question, is this so that Google can have similar, because there is excitement, because Apple waits so long to release an update and sort of packs
when it
everything
happens,
in.
it's like, wow.
When it happens, it's exciting. And especially emoji. In fact, many an Apple watcher will tell you that Apple kind of uses emoji to get people to install the privacy and data protection and bug fix stuff. If you wait to, maybe the emoji are ready to go, but if you wait until there's a critical bug fix that you can also shift in there, people will update because they want the latest emoji. But in the meantime, they're also improving the security of their phone. And so, yeah, it does make me kind of wonder, is Google looking for that same kind of excitement that comes around a new point release for iOS in the Android system? And if so, I say good for them, and I say it worked on me because I think that some of those features that are coming out are very cool. So yeah, I think that, again, pros and cons to both methods, and I do wish that there was a way to quickly or more quickly get out some of the features that Apple works on over time.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you. Pluses and minuses on both sides. I think it's one of those situations of grass is greener. You know what I mean? Because I often find myself wishing that Google's kind of solutions on some of this stuff were more baked than they are. Something comes out and then we got to wait for an update to fix the thing that they overlooked and blah, blah, blah. And it feels like that drags out. And, over time, I and I know a lot of Google users just kind of feel sometimes Google jumps the gun on certain things when they're pushing out an update for something, and it just doesn't feel quite there looking from the outside looking in on the iOS side, we of course only see the roses and the rose petals as far as that is concerned, because it always seems like Apple really does have a nice kind of concerted effort across teams to say, hey, we've got this new feature, and what do you know? You're getting everything. All apps tap into it and support it, and it just becomes this bigger thing instead of kind of this, which is neat. It's nice to have these features, but it's kind of just like these little bits and pieces here and there versus like this major update that's like, oh man, it's like my OS just got a refresh, and and like these features are nice. I don't know how much I'm going to use most of them in reality, though. So how excited will I be to use some of these features? Probably not that much, but at the same time, I'm happy that Google does it, because it used to be way worse. It used to be that any of these changes happened with a major revision, and that meant that most phones never got it because updates on Android pale in comparison to the platform like iOS does their updates. So there's very different approaches, and I think I've definitely gotten used to how Google does it right now, but there's few times where I feel truly excited. Android 12 Developer Preview 1 just released last week, and though the Developer Preview doesn't show it, there are lots hidden underneath the surface. Actually, Michal Rahman from XDA Developers was our guest on All About Android this week. And primarily because he and his team have picked apart the source code to find all of the breadcrumbs and the hints at what's coming. And everything points to a very major kind of UI refresh on this version. And so for the first time in a while, I'm excited for the new version of Android, not just because it's a new version of Android, but because yay, Google's injecting some life into this and bringing some excitement to it. So, they're just different approaches, I suppose.
Yeah.
Let's see here. So we've got your story of the week coming up, and I'm super curious to hear about Super Follow from Twitter. But first,
Super Follow. Whoa.
Super Follow. What is it? It reminds me of Google. Oh yeah, at Google I/O, however many years ago, YouTube announcement for Super Chat. There was this lady on the stage. She said Super Chat a million times. It was just. Kind of a funny couple of words, and then how she was saying it, and I know it's a big deal for YouTube creators and everything, but it reminds me of that. So Super Follow. We'll talk about that in a second. But first, let's thank the sponsor and pay some bills. This episode of Tech News Weekly is brought to you by Nureva. Nureva is super cool, and I'm an audio nerd. I love all things audio. Nureva is like audio nerd mecca. It's really cool what they do. Obviously we're not in the office right now. A lot of us are still at home. We're thinking about heading back to the office at some point. We know we're going to make it there. And when we are there, the ways that we meet, well, they're going to have to change. It's just the world we live in right now. Distancing can have big impacts for meeting room audio, and may actually require changes in how rooms are configured. The most important factor is the need for good mic coverage. And I mean, we talk with so many people from so many different parts of the world, and everybody has a different mic setup. So we know all about good mic coverage on a personal one-to-one basis, but talk about a room full of people and how you get all those people talking to each other in the meeting space and having it sound good. It's not easy. Most conventional audio systems don't offer the flexibility that you actually need to easily accommodate changes in the environment. Beamforming systems, they're going to need to be adjusted, and actually you're probably going to need an expensive technician to do that. Tabletop systems might actually require additional mics. You might have to sanitize the mics in between meetings, lots of changes. Both may require meeting participants to actually change their behavior. So sitting in a predetermined spot or facing a certain direction, that sort of stuff. Well, what if there was a better way to get clear, reliable audio and let your team just kind of act naturally and still feel safe? And that's what Nureva Audio is. It's designed for distancing. It's super cool what they do. One analyst called Nureva Audio the first socially distanced mic system. Nureva actually uses a completely different approach to audio conferencing that they call microphone mist technology. And what it does, it fills a room with thousands of virtual microphones. You get a true full room coverage, so people can actually be heard from anywhere they are in the room. It doesn't matter which way they're sitting or which way they're facing or how they're distanced. It's just clear, clean audio. And you can kind of see it looks kind of like a sound bar, but there's microphones in there all positioned in different ways to virtually hit most parts of the room. So you get true full room coverage, and people can be heard everywhere. You don't need to bring in technicians with Nureva Audio. You can install each microphone and speaker bar on the wall yourself. So it's super easy to do. Nureva Audio automatically adapts to any room configuration, and Microphone Mist technology actually has 4 patents. Nureva Audio products have won numerous awards, including the Top New Technology Award at ISE 2020 for the Nureva HDL 200 system. So no matter the size of your room, they have a full line of systems that will cover a small space, medium space, large spaces. HubSpot is actually a happy customer. Jimmy Ann is their principal collaboration engineer. And Jimmy says, we were so impressed with the sound quality, the ease of install, and the ease of use of the HDL 300 system. It was a no-brainer for us to adopt it. And it really is one of those things that once you try it, you got to have it. You got to have it in your system. You know how it's going to improve your meetings, and it's just awesome. To learn more how Nureva Audio is the simple and cost-effective way to let your teams distance in meetings and still act and converse naturally, still feel natural in those meetings, visit nureva.com/twit, and I'll spell that out. That's NUREVA.com/twit. Nureva is awesome technology with Microphone Mist technology. Check it out for yourself. And we thank Nureva for their support of Tech News Weekly. All right. So Twitter's going to get me to pay to use the service. What is this all about?
Yeah. So Twitter today at an investor call announced some new features that will be coming to the platform. One of those features is called the Super Follow, and it is kind of a way it's like Patreon, but for Twitter. The idea is that folks who are on Twitter, creators could introduce a subscription, which is the super follow. And an example given is that this creator offers a subscription for $4.99 a month that you can cancel at any time you want to. And what does a person get if they pay $4.99 a month? They get a supporter badge that they can, have on their own page. So if I supported Jason Howell, then I could get a badge that said Howlers, and that would be on my profile. And then subscriber-only newsletters. So this makes sense with Twitter's recent acquisition of, I think it's called Review, which is a newsletter platform. I signed up for Review recently just to see how it all works. And they're very adamant on getting you to create a newsletter, which I have not done yet. But they keep emailing me like, hey, what have we done something wrong? What's going on? How come we haven't set up an email or a newsletter yet? You need help? What's going on? Anyway, so I'm not surprised that a subscriber-only newsletter is part of this, given their acquisition of Review. Exclusive content, so that could be tweets that only their fans can see. Deals and discounts. So I don't quite know what that means just yet. I guess it could be that there could be coupon codes that if you've got a merch shop or something, then you could put codes in there. And then community access, meaning access to another feature that we're going to talk about, which are communities. And so communities are this idea that it's like Facebook groups, but for Twitter. So I might have a community called Chuffed for Chihuahuas, and it's just a group of people who love Chihuahuas. And you've got your little header, and the group kind of has all of these little tweets in their little community where you can all share posts and share messages and things like that. So these are two things, and the communities feature is not necessarily tied to the super follow. So it sounds like groups are going to be able to be created regardless of whether you do a super follow. You will be able to create communities just as a feature, but you can put those communities behind the paywall of a super follow. So Currently, there's no timeline on when these features are going to be launched. Twitter just said that this is what's next for its platform this I'm quoting directly from The Verge, during a presentation for analysts and investors this afternoon. So they shared some mock-ups of what this would look like. And again, the super follow and the communities were the two kind of big features that the company is thinking about. Of course, everyone on Twitter is already snarking about it, about the super follow. But here's the thing, and I've heard this. This is not something just from me. This is something that I've heard from other people of color who exist, particularly in this space, this sort of podcasting, partially journalist, partially creator space. And, throughout the existence of Twitter, there have been lots and lots and lots and lots of problems with Twitter, and there have been lots of abuse issues with Twitter. There have been, many things that folks, including myself, are not happy with. But there is a certain level of privilege examination that needs to take place when it comes to casting aside the social network, the latest social network, and saying, I think that, this, not only is this a bad social network, but anybody who wants to be a part of it is a bad person for wanting to be a part of it. When not all of us have the community and the audience that will follow us to other places. It's easy for some folks to be able to say, I'm going to move over here and everybody I know is going to come there and be with me. But for me personally, I have built my audience, have built my community, and have achieved some of the things that I've achieved in life thus far because of, not in spite of, Twitter. And so it's not as easy for me to just say, I'm casting this platform aside, because that's where the people who care to hear what I have to say have always been, more so than any other platform. And so I'm not quick to poo-poo this idea, because there was a period of time. So I was working as a senior editor at Mobile Nations, and Mobile Nations was acquired. And during that period of time, there were layoffs, and I became a freelance journalist. And in that period of time where I was just doing freelance journalism, occasionally for Mobile Nations and some other publications, and podcasting kind of on the side at the time, Twitter was the platform that I used to give people a means to share their support if they wanted to. And, that was through other means, like I think it was, Coffee, the platform that's kind of like Patreon. And I know that if I didn't have that audience on Twitter, I would have been far worse off at the time. And so I can't just, cast this platform aside. And in this way, like, I don't want to snark about super likes, because I think that there are people out there, and especially folks from, disenfranchised groups, who will find success and support with something like this. So I want to be positive about that aspect of it, and I hope that it will, be something that Twitter does right and does well. And I think that part is where we have to examine, where we have to, pay attention. But to just be callous about it off the top feels a little gross to me, frankly, because it's where your audience is. If you can get support there, then I think that that's okay.
Yeah, and Twitter's really been behind the ball in a lot of different ways as far as social networks, are considered. So many of these other platforms have created systems where people who are their most ardent users and followed by, and not even saying people who are just followed by millions of people or whatever, but people. The cool thing about Twitter is you can find a following that's not a million people, but there's still a dedicated following. Like it's that small group of people that really cares about you enough to subscribe to your daily musings about who knows what, and they're willing to read every single one. And that's an amazing thing. That's what's kept me on Twitter. And yeah, I completely agree. It would be really. I mean, and this is proven so because I'm not nearly as active on any other platform. I'm not on Facebook. I have an Instagram account, but I hardly use it. I just can't get into the mode of it. Twitter works for me. So, and I'm not even saying that like I'm going to do the super follow thing. I honestly need to know more about it and kind of, understand it a little better. But it is nice to know that Twitter's kind of stepping into its own place of the importance of the social media web. It's been incredibly important, especially in the past 4 or more years. But it's still always been kind of seen as like this social network that just, I guess President Trump's on there and everybody's, reading all of his tweets, but it still can't get its act together. It's got so few users compared to Facebook and blah, blah, blah. And, I don't know that it's necessarily always deserving of that. It brings its own value and power, and I'm happy to be involved with it. So I'm happy to see Twitter actually thinking about things, thinking about its business in new ways, even if it is doing something that other platforms have done for a while or had some sort of option to. I think it's great that Twitter offers it, and we'll see how successful it is. You're absolutely right. People have their following where they have it. Some people have a lot of privilege and the ability to take that following and take it elsewhere or make something big out of it. But some of us are just happy with the following that we have, and we're going to stick where we are.
Yep. I want to be where the people are. I think that's a song. I don't know.
It is now.
Wow. There we go. We promised there would be some sort of singing. It wasn't quite a sea shanty, but it happened in the end.
Not quite.
When does our show publish, Jason Howell?
We publish every Thursday, Mikah Sargent, twit.tv/TNW, every Thursday, sometime in the afternoon. We record this in the morning, Pacific time, 11 a.m. Pacific. And then John Ashley edits it and turns it around and publishes it. So it's usually ready by late afternoon, early evening. And just go to twit.tv/TNW and you'll always find the latest episode there. Audio, video formats, how to subscribe, link out to YouTube. The whole shebang is there.
And of course, you can follow us on social media. We are at Twit on Twitter, where maybe one day you'll be able to super follow us. At twit.tv on Instagram, at Twit Talk on TikTok. And if you want to follow me on social media networks, I'm pretty much at Mikah Sargent on all of the things. Or you can head to chihuahua.coffee, CHIHUA.coffee, where I've got links to those places. And of course, check out Smart Tech Today, which will be recording live later today. And iOS Today, which will record live tomorrow with Rosemary Orchard. Oh, what about you, Jason?
Nice. Twitter, at Jason Howell. That's where I'm most active. If I have something to say, I'm usually going to tweet it out there. Or, All About Android, which is my show that's all about, Android. Big thanks to John Ashley, already mentioned. Thank you, John, for editing and switching and turning the show around each and every week. Also, thanks to Burke at the studio for doing all the things behind the scenes, testing our guests to make sure that they're show ready, their audio and video and everything. And I know that you as a listener and watcher probably appreciate that hard work there. That's it for this week. We'll see y'all next week on another episode of Tech News Weekly. Take care.
Hey, folks, I'm Ant Pruitt, host of Hands of Photography here on TWiT TV. I know some of you have gotten yourself a brand new camera, or you just had a camera sitting around and can't quite figure out how to get the most out of it. Well, I have a solution. My show, Hands on Photography. So subscribe right now to learn how to get the most out of that camera. I'm going to show you how to make those images pop. I don't care if it's a Canon camera. I don't care if it's a Sony, Nikon, iPhone, Android, even a inexpensive Android device. I got you covered. So head on over to twit.tv/hop and subscribe today.